It was a quiet Sunday evening, the kind of evening that's supposed to feel warm and familiar. The kind where you sit at the table with family, pass around dishes filled with love, and laugh over stories you've heard a dozen times before. But that night, something was off. And it started with the stew. The smell hit me first, rich herbal, with an earthy depth that didn't quite feel right. Still, I smiled, thanked her, and took a spoonful. One bite. That's all it took. A slow bitterness crawled across my tongue, sharp and lingering, like a warning whispered too late. I glanced around. My husband, Mark, kept eating like nothing was wrong. His mother watched me with a smile, tight-lipped, almost rehearsed. Nobody said a word. No one acknowledged the strange taste. But I could feel it. The tension thick in the air, the unspoken questions dancing behind every polite smile. What was in that stew? Not just rosemary and thyme. Something darker. Something calculated. I swallowed, pretending everything was normal. But my heart began to race, and a chill crept up my spine. It wasn't just the food that tasted bitter. It was the room, the silence, the smile on her face. And in that moment I knew this wasn't just dinner. It was a test. Or worse, a warning. Ellie is a 28-year-old elementary school teacher, married for 3 years to Mark, a calm and loving IT engineer. They live in a quiet Connecticut suburb where life seems calm and peaceful. Or at least that's how it seems on the surface. But beneath the surface, Ellie is facing a quiet, stressful challenge from the woman she calls her mother-in-law, Mrs. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore was a widow, an old-fashioned and strict woman with old-fashioned ways of thinking, always controlling and hard to accept her daughter-in-law in her own way. The relationship between her and Ellie could never be called close. She never spoke directly, but every cold look, every meaningful sigh, every forced smile was like a performance in a play Ellie had never auditioned for. This undercurrent of tension blew like a cold wind through every moment of their life together. Not just the big things, but even the smallest details became the subject of scrutiny and judgment. The way Ellie folded her napkin, the way she chose her condiments for meals, and even the way she spoke to Mark were all closely watched by her mother-in-law, as if she had to be perfect or she would be eliminated. Mark, who is the middle man, always trying to make peace but has difficulty pleasing the two most important women in his life. He loves Ellie, but also respects his mother. This makes her feel even more alone and helpless. All of these pent-up feelings came to a head one fateful Sunday evening, the traditional family meal where Mrs. Whitmore insisted on making a special stew for everyone. It was a moment when the silence, the bitterness of the food, and the meaningful glances began to speak volumes that words could not. Everything seemed to change over the course of one dinner, and Ellie couldn't help but wonder. What exactly was hiding in that stew? It was a Sunday evening, and Ellie had accepted her usual invitation to her mother-in-law, Mrs. Whitmore. But this time something was different. Her mother-in-law insisted on preparing the entire meal herself, refusing to let Ellie help despite her polite requests. "Sit down, I've got everything covered," she said in a firm voice that could not be argued with. When Ellie entered the kitchen, the aroma wafting from the large pot of stew was enough to awaken her senses. But as soon as she lifted the first bowl to her lips, she realized something was wrong. The stew was not as sweet or rich as she had expected. Instead, bitterness overwhelmed her. Not the light herbal kind, but a deep, sharp bitterness that instantly dried her throat. No one said anything about the bitter taste. The atmosphere around the table was so quiet that you could hear even breathing. Mark continued to eat normally, as if there was nothing unusual about the stew. His mother-in-law smiled slightly, her eyes flashing with an unreadable light, as if waiting for Ellie's reaction. She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking, her heart was beating faster. Her intuition told her that something was wrong. Ellie tried to swallow each spoonful, but the feeling of unease grew. She knew it couldn't stop there. After dinner, while everyone was busy cleaning up, Ellie secretly scooped a small portion of the stew into a plastic container and hid it in her bag. She decided to check to see what was really going on. That evening, Ellie stopped by her best friend's veterinary clinic, who had a background in chemistry and food safety. She gave her friend a sample of the food and asked her to test it for any unusual substances. While waiting for the results, Ellie couldn't sit still. She began digging into her husband's family history. By asking acquaintances and searching through documents, she discovered something shocking. Mrs. Whitmore had studied folk herbalism, including knowledge of natural poisons used in traditional medicine. This revelation made everything clear to Ellie. The bitterness in the stew was not an accident or a cooking mistake. It was a message, a warning hidden in the spoonfuls she had just enjoyed. She began to suspect that her mother-in-law was not simply controlling her with words and attitude, but that she might be using more subtle means to bring her to her knees. Ellie wonders, who can she trust in this house? And more importantly, can she escape the menacing vortex that is tightening around her? I never thought my life would turn into a twisted episode of Top Chef meets Criminal Minds. Bitter stew? Please. That was just the appetizer. What I really got served that night was a full-course meal of emotionally simmered revenge with a dash of generational trauma. Honestly, if cooking with hostility was an Olympic sport, Mrs. Whitmore would have taken home the gold, silver, and bronze. Determined to crack the mystery behind that stew, I decided to try my hand at making it myself. After all, if I could replicate the recipe, maybe I could figure out what exactly made it taste like a vendetta in a pot. So there I was, chopping, simmering, and tasting, trying to channel the family secrets Mrs. Whitmore guarded like a dragon hoarding treasure. But instead of bitterness, my version came out, well, edible. Maybe a little bland, but certainly not the slow-burning poison disguised as comfort food that I was served. It was in that moment that I realized the so-called secret recipe wasn't really about herbs or spices. It was about something else entirely. The only thing my stew was simmering was resentment, stirred with a heavy hand of judgment and simmered in decades of unresolved family drama. Honestly, the real secret ingredient was the unspoken war between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, boiled down into every bitter spoonful. Comparing the two versions felt like comparing grandma's favorite heirloom to a blueprint for covert operations. I couldn't help but laugh to myself, well, maybe a nervous chuckle, thinking, should I thank her for teaching me survival skills disguised as cooking lessons? Because let me tell you, nothing prepares you for the subtle art of dodging poisonous looks and loaded dishes, quite like having a mother-in-law who's part culinary expert and part covert operative. There's something darkly hilarious about the fact that what was supposed to be a loving family Sunday dinner turned into a tactical showdown where every bite carried a hidden meaning. Instead of passing down recipes, it felt like Mrs. Whitmore was passing down a masterclass in psychological warfare, with stew as the weapon of choice. So, while I was busy playing detective in the kitchen, I also learned a crucial life lesson. When you marry into a family where the pot simmers with secrets, it's best to bring your own ladle, and maybe a gas mask. Ellie never formally accused her mother-in-law, lacking any hard evidence. The bitter taste in the stew, the knowing glances, or the strong feelings she felt could not be turned into words or legal evidence. And in a family like that, sometimes silence was the only way to survive. Instead of confronting her directly, Ellie decided to change her strategy. She started refusing to eat anything her mother-in-law cooked. Whenever she was invited to eat, she politely declined and suggested inviting her mother-in-law to her house. The atmosphere was much more pleasant now that she had control over everything in her kitchen, and her mother-in-law no longer had the culinary power to throw at her. Ellie also began recording conversations between her and her mother-in-law, not to use as evidence, but simply to better understand the hidden words and gestures that Mrs. Whitmore always cleverly hid behind a polite smile. Through those recordings, Ellie learned to observe, read, and react more quickly to each sophisticated tactic that her mother-in-law used. One day, her mother-in-law brought a special stew for Ellie. She picked up the bowl, smiled gently, and asked, "Did you do something different with the stew? It tastes less deadly today." Mrs. Whitmore looked at Ellie for a moment, something in her eyes changing, a wordless acknowledgement that she knew she had noticed. But neither of them said anything else. Just a knowing look, like people who knew each other too well and were playing a game they didn't want to lose. From then on, family meals were no longer a tense arena, but a silent dialogue where subtlety and restraint reigned. Ellie understood that in this life, there are battles that do not require weapons, but only intelligence and sobriety. And although the stew may still be bitter, she has found a way to not be poisoned by it. The days of living under the same roof were not simple, but Ellie knew that, in those challenges, she learned more about her own strength, not just as a daughter-in-law who endured, but as a woman who knew how to protect herself with wisdom and calmness. And that stew? It's more than just a dish. It's a symbol of quiet family battles, of meaningful silences, and of how we choose to survive in the complex world of love and power. Sometimes, the poison isn't in the food. It's in the silence, the bitterness we serve each other at the table, every single day. That slow, creeping tension that sits heavier than any toxin, the unspoken grudges and judgments that can quietly unravel the strongest bonds. Family isn't always the safe haven we imagine. It can be a battlefield disguised as a dining room, where words are left unsaid but wounds are deeply felt. In my story, the stew was more than just a meal. It was a symbol of a relationship strained by distrust, control, and unhealed wounds from the past. It taught me that sometimes the hardest poison to detect is not something you taste on your tongue, but something you feel in your heart. The toxicity of a family dynamic can be more damaging than any harmful ingredient ever could. So, what would you do if the person who raised the one you love most wanted you gone? How would you protect yourself when the enemy wears the face of family? It's a question that doesn't have easy answers because love and loyalty often complicate the fight for survival within a household. But recognizing the poison is the first step toward breaking free from it. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a family meal that left a bad taste, not just in your mouth, but in your soul? A moment when the dinner table felt more like a courtroom than a place of warmth? Share your stories, your experiences, or even your thoughts on how to navigate these difficult relationships. Sometimes, just speaking up can be the beginning of healing. Remember, family doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. But it should never be a place where you feel endangered or silenced. If you find yourself trapped in bitterness or silence, know that you're not alone, and there are ways to find peace beyond the stew. So comment below. Let's talk about those tough dinners, those hidden battles, and the resilience it takes to keep showing up, plate after plate, in search of something better.